Hello, welcome back to Vallejo Health and Wellness Center's series on vaccinations. Again, my name is Dr. Aaron Moreland, and I'm going to be talking to you today about what is in a vaccine. Going to be talking about what a vaccine is and how vaccines work. And so just a reminder that the reason why we're doing today's talk and this whole series is to inform parents on making great choices for their children. And so whether they choose to vaccinate or not vaccinate, they'll have this information, they'll be able to use it, and they'll be able to feel the best about the decisions that they make with their children's health. So let's just jump right into it. So first I want to talk just briefly about how vaccines came to be, because up until just over 100 years ago, people really didn't even understand how microorganisms were around, and they didn't understand how they caused diseases. And so it really wasn't until the invention of the microscope that they really got that information. But really, even up to 1,000 years ago, people did recognize that some people that were around others that had a specific illness were able to be immune to that illness. Smallpox is a great example of that. So over 1,000 years ago, the Chinese were using dried up crusts of smallpox and poking the skin of people with it to induce immunity. It sounds gross, I know, but it was effective at the time. And so people realized that they could increase or improve immunity by being around this, but they didn't really understand how that worked. It wasn't really until 1796 when Edward Jenner actually introduced the far safer method of inoculation by using a cowpox virus. He noticed that nursemaids that were around cows that had cowpox were immune to smallpox, which the rest of the world at the time was being affected by, and so that's where he came up with the idea of using that cowpox virus to induce immunity to smallpox. So his success and general acceptance of the procedures that he used would later drive the general nature of vaccination developed by Pasteur and the others towards the end of the 19th century. And that's really how we've come to have vaccines. So when we look at the definition of a vaccine, we can see that there's two different terms that we tend to use. One being vaccination, the other being immunization. And a lot of people will use the term immunization and vaccination as the same term, but really when we look at the definition, they're not interchangeable, that they are two different things. Vaccination, the definition of it, is the physical act of administering a vaccine or a toxoid, whereas immunization is the process of inducing artificial immunity by administering an immunobiologic. Now the key to understanding the difference between those two is that one assumes that the person has immunity to the disease, where the other doesn't guarantee immunity, but it is the administering of an immunobiologic. So according to the CDC, now every time as you go through the seminar series, you're going to see reference to MMWR, and that's references from the CDC. So according to the CDC, they say, although persons often use vaccination and immunization interchangeably, the terms are not synonymous. The administration of an immunobiologic cannot be automatically equated with the development of adequate immunity. So by using the word immunization, we tend to assume, well, now that person's immune, but we know that that's not necessarily the case, and that's why they don't want people using those terms interchangeably. So vaccination is the term that we should be using. So just because you get a shot doesn't mean that you're going to be immune, and just because you can produce antibodies doesn't ensure that you will not get the disease either. So vaccines fall under the category of artificial acquired immunity, meaning that you're not getting it naturally and it has to be acquired. It's not something that you're born with. So the artificial means that many vaccines are administered by are either through injections, that's your MMR, your hepatitis B. Then there's another form called inhaled, which the flu mist is an inhaled version of a vaccination. And then there's oral, and polio falls under that category. So again, as a reminder, we need to remember that vaccination is the physical act of administering a vaccine or a toxoid. So how does a vaccine work? The premise behind the vaccine, which many people believe, is that an antigen is injected into the body and the body responds by developing antibodies. Once the body develops antibodies, it's immune to the disease. So many people believe that, okay, I've been vaccinated for that illness, now I'm immune to the illness. But it's much more complicated than that. What we need to realize is that first, you may actually not develop sufficient, if any, antibodies to the disease. So just because you get a vaccination doesn't mean that it created antibodies in the body, or that it created enough that it would actually make it so that you're immune to the disease. Second, many times the antibodies developed are not long-lasting, so you can have a waning effect, or maybe you're immune for a few years, but then you potentially could get it again. And so that's the reason why they have many boosters, and that's the reason why we're finding that many of the vaccines that people had in childhood are now having to be boosted again because they didn't create a lifelong immunity. And then finally, or third, I should say, because there are many different strains of a virus, you may not develop the right antibodies. Now, a good example of that is the flu shot. The flu virus, there's roughly about 867 strains of the flu virus. And so the flu shot that you get has 3 of those strains. And so if you're exposed to anything else other than those 3 strains, you're not going to have immunity to it. So we know that it's not just about creating antibodies. We got to create antibodies to the very specific strain of that virus. And then finally, we also need to realize that the type of immune reaction you create typically is more of an allergic response in nature due to the mode of transmission of most diseases. Most diseases are what we call airborne diseases, and so the way you would get that is through airborne, and so there's different lines of defense. And so we have our first, second, and third line of defense, and a vaccine or a bacteria have to travel through those lines of defenses. By putting the vaccine into the body just directly into the bloodstream, you bypass 2 of those lines of defense, and so the body is not given the chance to change that virus, which is what happens through the first and second line of defense. And so the body then has more of an allergic reaction to the vaccine. So this sets up a problem. When we create an immune system that becomes extracellular reaction rather than an intracellular. And what that means is we do have cells that attack viruses, and they come in and they kind of swallow them and chew them up. That's your intracellular. That's your white blood cells coming in and attacking the virus. But we also have an extracellular response where a white blood cell will release antibodies and put a marker on that so that the body will then attack it. And so that's what we call an extracellular. Some of those antibodies that really release are histamine, and histamine is more what we tend to think of when we have an allergic response. And so this causes some people to have more of a Th2 response rather than a normal balanced Th1 response. And so the problem with that is now when that body comes in contact with other antigens, it tends to have that Th2 response or that extracellular response, and then that person tends to have more of an allergic response to things, and so they tend to have more asthma and allergies, things that we call atopic disorders. And so it's important to realize that that is a potential that can happen, especially in people that already have a tendency towards atopic disorder. So a family that has a history of allergies and such may find that it's more prone to develop that after having a vaccine. So how does a vaccine work? Again, in a child's body, we have to realize that a child's body is different than an adult body. We tend to think that they're just small adults, and they're really not. Their immune systems are in a different, they're in development while they're growing, and so we need to realize our children's body ready for these vaccines that we're giving. A child's immune system is much different than an adult in that it's not fully mature until about the age 11 or 12. That's according to the Merck manual. Also, other organs such as kidneys and liver, they're not as high functioning until about age 2, and so we have to look at realizing that the vaccine has other things in it that we may need to have higher functioning organs to be able to deal with that too. Now, Dr. Paul Offit, who is a very pro-vaccine doctor, he says that a baby's immune system can handle as many as 10,000 vaccines in one day. And so it's interesting to think that that you would be able to do that to somebody's body and not have a negative effect, but he believes that for sure that you can do that. So that's how a vaccine works. So what isn't a vaccine? Many people believe that vaccines contain only the dead germ, which causes you to have immunity to the disease that you're vaccinating for. Vaccines do contain more than that, though. They contain more than just the virus, the bacteria, or the toxoid. So let's look at what is it that's in a vaccine. So first, we have to realize that vaccines are for preventing viral diseases, bacterial diseases, or toxins that are created by the bacteria. So the vaccine will have, depending on the specific vaccine, an inactivated form of the microorganism, a live attenuated form of the microorganism, a toxoid, or they may have a subunit of the microorganism. So one of those things could be in there. And so that's one of the things that's in a vaccine. Now we have to realize that because a virus cannot replicate or reproduce itself, it must be grown on living tissue. And so some examples of tissues being used today are monkey kidney, rabbit kidney, chicken embryo, and then this, you do read this right, it is aborted human fetal tissue is another thing that they grow it on. So when we look at this, we can see that understanding viruses, a lot of people call them dead. They're not truly dead, but they can't replicate by themselves because they don't have the DNA to be able to do that, so they need to inject themselves into your cells or into a living organism cell so that they can reproduce itself. And so by using monkey kidney, rabbit kidney, and chicken embryo, you're using other animals, so their sets could potentially set up a problem. So what they have found is using aborted human fetal tissue can get rid of this problem of having cross reactions and such. So the process of doing this is a fairly lengthy process. So the way, as I said, that it produces itself, injects its DNA into another cell, and then can reproduce itself. So then once that's done, and we look at the ethical approach to this, is that we're looking at aborted human fetal tissue. So if you have an issue with abortions, which I personally do, if a person does have that, then they would rather choose an option for a vaccine that doesn't use aborted fetal tissue. Unfortunately, some of them don't have that option. So then once the virus is reproducing and growing and gets to the point where they have enough of it, then they'll destroy the vaccine, or the virus I should say, by using formaldehyde. So with bacteria, what vaccinations for bacterial infections will contain either the entire bacteria itself, including its DNA, or pieces of the cell wall of the bacteria. Now the difference between this and virus is you don't have to grow it on living tissue or onto another cell, because bacteria grow and reproduce on their own. So they can be grown on different cultures and they can be produced fairly quickly. So far we know that the vaccine contains either viruses, bacteria, whole or partial, a toxoid, and formaldehyde. Because this is not enough to cause an immune response, they must also add what is called an adjuvant. Some examples of adjuvants are aluminum, oil emulsions, including peanut. Now some people may be thinking, okay, that could be potentially why so many children have peanut allergies. Now peanut oil is typically only used in Europe, so I don't believe that that's the big reason why we see so many allergies in peanut allergies in today, especially in America. The other thing that they'll have in there is an adjuvant. They could have bacterial, liposomes, and other immune stimulating complexes. Now the key to this is we have to understand, having aluminum in a vaccine, is that aluminum is eliminated from the body primarily through the kidneys. Now an infant kidney function is low at birth and doesn't reach full capacity until 1 to 2 years, according to what the Merck manual says. The amount of aluminum in the recommended individual dose of a biological agent shall not exceed 1.250 milligrams. Now that's according to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Now a typical vaccine day, if a child was to get the DTaP, which is diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, hepatitis B, Hib, and Prevnar vaccine, they would get the equivalent of 1.475 milligrams of aluminum. So we can see that that's actually more than what the EPA allows. We also have to look at what about cumulative amounts. When we look at a child not being able to clear out the aluminum as fast because they're low functioning kidney, you're going to have an accumulating factor as well. So this is the end of this first video. We'll be continuing on to talk more about what's in a vaccine in part 2 of this one.